What happens when two bass road warriors spend quality time talking music and life with one of their peers? Find out every Monday at 8 on Notes from an Artist. Bassist, educator, author David C. Gross and bassist and head honcho of KnowYourBassPlayer.com, Tom Semioli, trade dates with the legends of rock, jazz, funk, blues, folk, country, and more. Notes from an Artist. Revealing conversations with the legends who've created the soundtrack of our lives. Every Monday at 8 on CygnusRadio.com. And check out previous episodes on our podcast. NotesFromAnArtist.buzzsprout.com.
Hi, this is David Gross, and you're listening to Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com. Hey, today we've got a really great show. My old friend, and when I say old, I mean old. We're going to be talking with Arno Hecht, who's a member of the Uptown Horns. Now, the Uptown Horns, if you don't know, have played with virtually everybody. We're talking the Stones, we're talking Lou Reed, Robert Plant's Honey Drippers, on and on and on. This is going to be a wonderful conversation, and I want to welcome my co-hosts Tom Semioli and Arno Hecht. So guys, let's get it on.
We are admitting Arno into the 21st century. Here we go. And
there he is.
Can you hear him?
All righty. Good.
Oh, amazing. You know what? I think we're done, David. I think this is just a great episode.
Yeah, thanks very much, Arno.
So I think I may have told you this. You know, there was a point, because I'm always the reason I had like an old cell phone,
right, like
way longer than anybody else did.
Right.
And finally my daughter was like, Dad, you have to get like a smartphone.
Right.
So I got an iPhone finally. Well, there was a point, I don't know how many years ago, like 15, 16 years ago, whatever it was, where for one reason I can't even begin to explain, I went for about a year and a half without having a cell phone, period.
Lucky
and
you.
Kenny Laguna, who's Joan Jett's manager, producer, somebody we've had like a very, very long, for decades, had this relationship with. And Kenny's kind of a kibitzer. So he gave me like mounds of shit about this. Like, you know, you're in this friggin' business and like, you don't have a cell phone. Like, how insane are you and stuff like that. So when I finally got my little old phone that I called Kenny up and I said, Kenny, I finally got a cell phone. Here's the number. He said, welcome to the 80s. So that'll tell you a few things right there.
I admire the fact that you maintain your AOL address. I actually still have mine. I mean, I use Gmail professionally, but it's like, you know, the Fender bass. They come back in style. You know,
there you go. Well, you know what? I was one of these guys, and Dave can tell you that when CDs suddenly like became all there was,
86.
I was one of these guys who railed constantly about like, well, I don't know, for my ears, vinyl sounds better. Vinyl sounds better. And people would be like, man, you're living in the past. You got to get used to changes. CDs are on copy, this and that and the other thing. Well, what do you know? Suddenly vinyl. So I never gave up my vinyl, by the way. I've got about 1,500 vinyl albums. I have my Technics turntable that I never surrendered.
We no longer can hear the difference. So it doesn't really matter.
But what happens so far, you know, all of a sudden, what do you know? Vinyl's making this big comeback. And my daughter's got like, I don't know, how like 125, 150 albums on vinyl and a turntable because, you know, she
you know, what's ironic about the resurgence in vinyl is that a lot of later records were recorded digitally. And I think even some of the master tapes to a lot of classic albums were lost. And of course, there was the Universal Fire. So if you were to buy Jimi Hendrix Are You Experienced on vinyl, what you're actually getting is a vinyl version of the CD, the digital mix. So if you really want to hear Are You Experienced, you got to find it in an antique shop.
That was the Jimi Hendrix Experience. Are you experienced? This is Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com.
I have an old buddy that's what he does. He kind of deals and finally buys up collections and sells like at different venues and stuff like that. And he's always going to these vinyl conventions.
Me too. I'm a big vinyl collector.
Well, you know what?
Arno, tell me, what does a horn player do during a COVID lockout? I mean, at least for guitar players, bass players, drummers, we can all put on headphones and have relative silence. How did you handle COVID? What was that that like for you?
No playing out live. In fact, one of my ongoing gigs for, I don't know how many years now, 15 years, something like that, 14 years, is with Dion, the guy who did The Wanderer and Run Around Sue and Abraham Martin and John. And we had a bunch of gigs booked for last summer, and they all got canceled and postponed for this summer. But unfortunately, probably a couple of months too early. So all the gigs he had booked, they're all like canceled and postponed till next summer.
That was Dion, a live version in New York doing The Wanderer. But what's interesting about that is you had Simon and Garfunkel as the backup singers, and of course that great sax solo was Arno Hecht. This is Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com.
I mean, things ain't what they used to be, but there were studio gigs along the way, and I did those studio gigs. I did a couple of things that this wonderful, super talented woman by the name of Nancy Atlas, way out in Montauk, and she put together a thing. Do you know Stephen Talkhouse, the place?
Sure, I love that guy.
She organized this thing in September where she had different bands and configurations of players, among which was me playing with her, come to Stephen Talkhouse and play on their stage. No audience. All the windows and doors were open and stuff. And she had like a 3-man film crew, and they filmed the whole thing. And then she proceeded to do like 6 or 7 installments, which were kind of a pay-per-view thing. And she got people to, like, different companies to sponsor it and stuff, and then split the money evenly. She's exceedingly honest. Everybody got a fair chunk of change for doing that. And I did a thing at the beginning of March, another Long Island group, wonderful group called Wondrous Stories. They did a show that was like a tribute to The Who, the 50th anniversary of The Who's
Right, a repertory.
album.
Which,
And so
has, famous saxophonists all over it,
Here it is, and they had Wondrous Stories plus 3-man horn section. These 4 amazingly talented Broadway actors, singer, dancers, including guy Mike Wartella, who's going to be playing Dion in the show about Dion called The Wanderer. This woman, Lana Gordon. Lana Turner's another.
I was going to say.
Lana Gordon, who's just got it all going on. And, she was in The Lion King in Chicago. And
a real Corrine.
I mean, seriously. And they nailed the piss out of the songs. I mean, they did most of the vocals, and they had like some choreographed moves. And it was great. It was like a pay-per-view thing also. But anyway, this is all a very long-winded answer to how I spent my summer vacation.
Well, let's start. This is your life, Arno. Tell us about how did you start your journey as a musician? Take us back.
Well, hold on a second.
Oh, wait a second. David has a...
I got to do a full disclosure. Arno and I have known each other when records were square.
Yes.
That's how far back we go.
And the earth was cooling. Yes.
That's right.
But when we were going to do this interview, I started thinking about how far back we go. And it's like 1972, 73. I'm starting to do studio work, right? And Arno is bemoaning me on the phone one day. He's going, oh, man, I'm just not getting enough work. And I go, Arno, I'm a bass player, so I'm going to get the first studio work. You're a sweetener. You're on afterward. Now, let's take this word afterwards apart. Afterwards means Tom Waits. Afterwards means the Rolling Stones. Afterwards means Jay Geils, James Brown, Cameo, the B-52s. You get what I'm going for? So the reality of the situation, you and I are now 50 some odd years later. You've got gold records all over.
We started when we were 5, Dave. That's like...
That's right. I remember when Arno, it was so long ago, they didn't even have reeds. He had to cut trees down and whittle out of the bamboo.
Right.
Get this. All right. So
and I had to fight beavers to get at them,
Right. Did you play at the Last Supper? I bet you that was one of your early gigs.
That's why it was the Last Supper.
The last brunch, I meant.
The last brunch. I started, when I was like in 5th grade, I started on clarinet. A couple of years later, I added sax and started getting into sax. First band I was in, I was 13 years old. our criterion for hiring a drummer was he had to play the solo on Wipeout.
Absolutely. It still is.
And then, all through high school and college, basically, that's what I did. I played in different bands. And
where did you grow up in Queens? Where did you grow up in Queens?
Holliswood.
Okay.
I went to Jamaica High School. And, that was just always what I did. I was a history major in college. I was going to be like a lawyer or a history prof. But by the time I graduated, I was like, screw this. I like being a musician. I don't want to go to grad school.
Who were some of your horn player role models?
Horn player role models. There's a whole bunch. I mean, of course, there's Charlie Parker and Sonny Rollins and John Coltrane. Sonny Rollins is really one of my all-time heroes.
That was Sonny Rollins with the great Ray Brown on bass, Shelly Man on drums. I'm an old cow hand. This is Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com.
But I come out of like sort of a rock and R&B thing, so there's a whole list of guys that, King Curtis.
You just heard Red Prysock doing hand clapping, and that was Plas Johnson doing Downstairs.
Big J McNeely, Lee Allen.
You were just listening to Big J McNeely doing Psycho Serenade, and after that, Walking with Mr. Lee with Lee Allen. This is Notes from an Artist on Cygnus Radio.
When this rock and roll thing started to happen, the big instrument on for solos and stuff was sax.
Right, before the Guitar Hero came into existence, sax was the go-to instrument for the solo section.
Yeah. So all those guys I mentioned, a lot of them came out of big bands and stuff like that.
Sure, yeah.
And they were in at the beginning of the change to R&B, right. Louis Jordan and Wynonie Harris and guys like that.
That was Louis Jordan doing Let the Good Times Roll, and that was Wynonie Harris doing Don't Roll Your Bloodshot Eyes at Me. Now, what's odd about that is both those songs I did in my big band. I had a band called the Mystic Knights, and Arno's group, the Uptown Horns, with a horn section. It was a great band. We did a lot of great old music, and I was playing a 6-string fretless bass, which was kind of odd for that music, but it fit in great. This is Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com.
So they invented the whole style of rock and roll sax playing, although you listen to all those solos. They were making this stuff up as they were going along.
Yeah, but you also have to, I would guess, take into consideration that those guys had jazz and either jazz or classical chops, because that's what you had to learn.
Yes.
And they applied that to rock and roll. So rock and roll was really, a pretzel, as they say. It was simple to them. And that's why they came up with such great licks, because they had this vocabulary to draw from.
Right. I mean, they were a little older than a lot of the bands who they soloed with. Mm-hmm. They were studio cats, they were the Breckers and Sanborns of their day and stuff. Yes. And they were, they had made... Some of them just had incredible chops.
Right.
I don't know if you've ever gotten into Earl Bostic. It was friggin' amazing.
What was that song you played for me last week? Because we'll play
Up There in Orbit.
Up There in Orbit. Great.
Yeah.
Tom, when you hear this, you won't believe it. This guy is blowing all over the place. Oddly enough, Coltrane worked for Earl Bostic.
Right. He was Coltrane started out playing in Bostic's band and continued later on to cite Bostic as an influence on his playing.
That was Up There in Orbit by Earl Bostic. This is Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com.
But they're great. I mean, Plas Johnson, he's the guy who played the Pink Panther theme. And wow, was he great.
You're probably saying to yourself, that doesn't sound like the Pink Panther theme I'm used to. Well, you're correct. This is a single that Plas Johnson put out. It's on Capitol Records, and it is the Henry Mancini tune, but it's Plas Johnson's version. This is Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com.
He's still alive, in fact.
He's now doing plasma.
Plasma. That's right. But he became Mancini's main sax soloist.
Yeah. All right. So how did you, obviously your reputation started to grow. How did you break into studio work?
It's a gradual thing. I played in this band and that band.
Right.
We'd make our demo and stuff. So I guess that would be my earliest studio experience. But then, some band and they'd be recording their indie album or whatever. And it's like, hey, man, can you come in and play sax? And, sure. It's very much a cumulative business. You do something and then somebody else hears about it or someone hears you on something.
Right, word of mouth, yeah.
One of my favorite examples that I cite, in fact, is how it can screw up a relationship. But I had, I was already had been doing a bunch of stuff and I already had the Uptown Horns together and so on and so forth. I was married at the time and my wife and we didn't have kids yet and we were planning on a night out. And I got a relatively last minute call to play on someone's demo for like $150 or something like that. And I was like, my wife was like, go do it. And so I played a solo on this guy's demo. And then what he did was he sent it out to a bunch of people. And one of the people he sent it to was Dan Hartman. And Dan called the guy up and said, look, I hope you don't feel bad. There's nothing I can really do for you. But who was the guy who played the solo? And then he got in touch with me. He had me play on the album that had I Can Dream About You on it.
Right, sure.
And then he had a song. He said, like, I need horns in the plural for something. I said, well, I got this horn section, the Uptown Horns. And so I got the rest of the guys on it. Over time, that led to us doing the James Brown album, including Living in America.
That was James Brown, Living in America. Arno Hecht, the rest of the Uptown Horns. This is The Halfway Point. This is Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com.
A couple of Joe Cocker albums and a Nona Hendrix album. And I mean, and it just all came out of that one stupid demo that
opened the door.
You just heard two songs with the Uptown Horns, Joe Cocker doing Unchain My Heart and Nona Hendrix doing Baby Go-Go. Our guest Arno Hecht on tenor sax, Crispin Cioe on alto sax, Paul Litteral on trumpet, and Bob Funk on trombone. This is Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com.
Many musicians have difficulty making the transition from the stage to the studio. How did you do that? Because obviously we know playing a gig and playing in the studio, two totally different animals.
Didn't feel like a problem,
Just
comfortable doing it. In fact, the studio, you have the option of, I want to do that again. I didn't like that take. And so it's actually, you're obviously, every breath is being recorded.
That's
and is
the thing,
audible in the control booth. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, you have the option of saying like, that sucked. Let me do that again. But you could do it. I mean, good engineers never had a problem, like we'll punch in at letter B, that kind of thing. And,
Arno, one thing that Tom and I always talk about is the education of the musician and how that has changed a lot. You said something at the beginning that is really telling about our society. And that was when you were in fifth grade, you were playing clarinet because the school had a music program.
No, actually not.
No,
but that was me like nudging my mom. Ma, I want to take clarinet lessons. I was into Benny Goodman and Mozart's clarinet concerto and shit like that.
Interesting, because when I went to school in New York, the school they gave me a clarinet. Now I don't know why. Particularly after I started playing it.
Started humming bass parts through it. So.
That's it. Schools back then were really into having the kids learning to play an instrument, where nowadays it's kind of, it's not so much frowned upon, it's not really part of their discipline.
Which is really, I mean, obviously in junior high, they had a music program. In high school, they had a music program and stuff. I just assumed that that's how it should be. And it was great. I kind of think music is important. It teaches kids a certain discipline and a certain way of thinking that's helpful in sort of like across the board in any number of subjects.
Right.
Math, for one. A lot of people don't realize that, Pythagoras invented the major scale.
I always knew it was his fault.
There you go. He's the one to blame.
When you think about it, it's not just those skills, it's listening, working together, and all these other intangibles that are so very important. How many CEOs play a musical instrument?
I wish they still did.
Yeah, really, they should.
Well, in certain cases, yeah.
In certain cases.
There's so much to be said for educating a musician. And obviously for you, if you didn't read music, you would not be doing all your studio work. There's only a certain amount of studio work that, just play a solo on this song.
Right. No, reading is very important. And I have to give credit where credit is due. And Dave knows this because I used to, he used to live nearby on the Upper West Side. And I consistently visit him after we were done. There was this guy by the name of Lynn Oliver. And he used to run what some people would call a jazz workshop. But more than anything, it was kind of like a finishing school for people who are already working young musicians to up your level of musicianship. He was a character and a half.
He was a hard taskmaster.
He was a very hard taskmaster.
The first time you invited me there, it was in the middle of a snowstorm or something. I had my big Fry boots on, all right? And of course, you went to Lynn Oliver for one thing, to learn to read your ass off, because those charts were not simple. So I'm in there, I'm reading everything perfectly, but I have my boots on. Stops the thing in the middle and goes, "You don't ever wear those boots again."
One of his rules was don't tap your foot. For one thing, you look stupid. And for the other thing is the drummer's the only guy who keeps time in the band. Doesn't matter how perfect your time is, you have to lock in with the drummer. You know, he would instill stuff like this. As far as reading went, he had like different classes, different level classes and stuff, but he had big band classes, you know, full big band. And he had the original Ellington and Basie and Tommy Dorsey, and somehow he got copies of the original charts. So he had thousands of charts. So you would have this fat book in front of you, and he would say, okay, number 175. And you pull up 175 and you go, okay, 1, 2, 1, 2, and you start playing. This guy had ears. He could tell what the fourth trumpet player was playing. And if you were like screwing up, he would stop the band and he'd go, okay, you from letter A, 1, 2, in front of like everybody. You had to stand there all by yourself. My sight reading went up like this, like inside of like 3 months. I mean, it was like, oh shit.
And see, the other thing about it, Tom, which was really incredible, is you really were sight reading because you had no prior knowledge. So you look at the chart and go, which is why, you know, when I teach my students, I have them read 4 bars ahead.
Right.
So that you're scanning before you screw up.
Right. That's it. Another one of his rules. And I mean, he hated rock and roll. His attitude was like, when rock and roll started, music died. You know, he was coming out of like a hardcore jazz swing era thing. But you could take what he had to say and apply it to general things. You know, like, for example, time and intonation. Like, you know what? If you play on a Joan Jett record, and I'm sure Lynn did not relate to Joan Jett, you still had to play in tune. Because, like, if you didn't, they could get guys who could. So it's like you had to have that stuff down. And one of his general rules, and again, applies very much to stuff we all do, he would say when you solo, you have to solo within the context, like appropriately for whatever music you're playing. So he said, like, you know, if you're playing a modal song, you can't play bebop licks. If you're playing like bebop, you can't be playing Dixieland shit. So if you're going to be playing like, you know, balls out rock and roll, you can't be playing like Coltrane licks, you know, like you're playing the wrong stuff.
That was Joan Jett doing the Gary U.S. Bonds cover, New Orleans, the Uptown Horns, featuring our guest Arno Hecht on saxophone. This is Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com.
A guy who had it all, like Michael Brecker, who's just right up there with the greatest of the greats. You listen to like when Michael Brecker played like James Taylor and Carly Simon, he stayed within the style. He didn't like suddenly start doing his Brecker thing. He knew I'm playing a certain kind of music and that's what I'm supposed to place.
That was James Taylor with Michael Brecker doing Don't Let Me Be Lonely Tonight. This is Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com.
But, you know, to be able to do that also, you really need wide ears. I mean, you have to listen to a lot of different records and you have to have an open mind. It's a different solo in a pop tune than it is in a jazz.
But also, things were much more homogenized back then. So nowadays, there's this chart, that chart, the other chart. Back then, Sinatra, Sammy Davis, and the Beatles.
The top 40 was more democratic. So just by tuning into an AM radio in the late 60s and even the 70s and FM, of course, you did get a music education because, like you said, right, you'd hear Sinatra and the Stones in the same, you know, set.
Like Strangers in the Night, the same summer that Paperback Writer and Mother's Little Helper were on the charts, as well as Cool Chart, See You in September, a lot of different styles.
Before the bean counters took over. Arno, so many horn players I know went down in the 80s when the DX7 became ubiquitous and keyboards really expanded and became affordable to the masses. I mean, I remember, David, it was the DX7 was the first mass-produced, wasn't it? And that
was Yamaha's version. Then, of course, you had the Poly 6 from Korg.
Yeah.
And a few others. But yeah, you're right.
How did the Uptown Horns, because I remember we all had DX7s, How did the Uptown Horns survive and even thrive when synthesizers became ubiquitous in the 80s?
Well, synthesizers, although they can get certain stuff, they can't really get the sound of a real horn section.
Right.
To a certain degree, they can. I mean, there have been times where we'd go into the studio and they'd have synth horns laying down the thing, and then they would say, cop what we're doing on the synth. But they wanted the real horn sound because can't compare. And particularly, and I'm happy to say this, saxophone, you just can't get a real sax sound out of a synth. You can get something close, and if you're just doing like some simple section whatever things, but if you want like a real sax sound, you got to get a sax player. Or another way of putting it is, it would be so complicated and so expensive to try and like get a real sax sound that you might as well just hire a sax player.
Plus, a keyboard player doesn't phrase like a saxophone player.
That's it. And there are little nuances in terms of bending notes and how long you hold a note and the length of the fall you do and whether you go bow or boo, and things like that, or just stop short.
Well, David, for us, it's the same with keyboard bass. How many times do you hear a keyboard bass phrase in fourths, and bass players don't play like that?
The sound I love best of all is where they call it fretless bass. All right, so I play a fretless bass, so I'm playing this on the... No, that doesn't even come close. But right. I wanted to ask you a question. Are there a lot of younger sax players coming up? Is it a wide grouping of folks, or is it sort of pared down, so to speak?
That's a good question. There are certainly younger players coming up on all axes, and some of them are amazing. The sad thing is that because of changes that have occurred in the biz, it's much harder for a young player to develop a career. I mean, there are always going to be people who have young guys who have bands and try and go somewhere with their band. Although with the Spotify shit, it's hardly a career also. But one of the problems, and it's one of my ongoing gripes, is that you now have entire genres of music that don't use a real instrument other than, all they use is synth. Yeah. I remember when guitar was kind of like a big deal in rock and roll. How many pop singles do you hear now where they're not even using a guitar? It's all synthesizer. Right. And the other thing is, again, forget about something esoteric like a sax. When was the last time you heard a solo on a top 40 single?
Right.
Solos used to be kind of a big thing,
That's part of the hit.
And unfortunately, it's obviously easier and cheaper for record labels to just hire one guy and just, maybe with the singer or something. In terms of sensibilities, it's I think of, which was the one that Van Halen did the solo.
I was thinking the same thing. Beat It's the first tune that comes to mind.
Nowadays, if Michael Jackson was alive and he was recording that song, the record company people would be like, no, you don't put a guitar solo on there. That's not what's happening, man. And so they wouldn't have Eddie Van Halen doing a guitar solo.
This is an interesting point we brought up with John Altman 2 weeks ago. We're talking about solos and arranging, obviously, John Altman. And what's happened in music, and you can maybe comment on this, is the change of the song form. For example, I grew up in the 70s, so even though my parents didn't care for Elton John or David Bowie, they heard the 32-bar song form, AABA, let's say, and they were familiar with it. So my mother could see from Elton, Elton, he reminds me of Ray Charles or Anthony Newley with David Bowie. And then, of course, you had the other ubiquitous song form is the 12-bar blues. If you heard Eric Clapton or Johnny Cash, pop music was based on those two song forms. Of course, their roots from jazz and classical music. Now, if you go to Cardi B, which I know gives David a cardiac arrest, or any other of these type of artists, there's no longer an intro. There's maybe a 4-bar chorus where the hook repeats every 15 seconds because that's what the advertisers say sells records. There's no bridge. There's no coda. So it's kind of strange. You talk about having a solo. Where do you put it?
I remember for all these years that there was this thing that a song has to have a hook. The hook is what sells the song. It's the part that people remember. It's the thing they sing to themselves. They may not know the rest of the song, but they know the hook.
Right.
I listen to so many songs today and go, where's the hook? Right. What happened to the hook? There used to be hooks. Now there's no hooks.
That's the hook.
I mean, I think that's strange. And the reality is that how many songs being put out now, are they going to be around in 5 years? Are they going to be around in 10 years? Are people going to be able to sing them? I mean, can you sing like a hook from some modern tune? Like what the hell do you sing?
Well, I think a lot of it, again, has to do with the song form. And you're right. You say the hook. My parents didn't like the Beatles. They thought they made a racket, but they knew She Loves You and Hey Jude because those songs had hooks.
They all had hooks. My Way had a hook, I mean, Strangers in the Night had a hook. They all did. I mean, that was the thing that sold the song.
I guess, and Dave and I were reflecting. I think we heard an interview with, can't remember who the artist was. I think it was Justin Timberlake, where he said he was writing beats for his new record.
That's it.
And I don't think you'd hear Carole King or Burt Bacharach saying, yeah, I'm writing beats for my new record.
I had a pretty close friend by the name of Phil Ash, played on Jagger's solo stuff, and he played with Billy Idol and this one and that one. And he also ran one of the bigger jingle houses in New York, one of the co-owners, Rocket Music. And he was like a synth whiz. I mean, in fact, way back when he was the keyboard player and like when we had our own band, his nickname was Brain. So that'll give you some idea. I mean, it was like, Phil, we need gotcha, and like, right. So he had this really funny story about it. He was hired to be, I guess, an artistic advisor or something on some rap song. And there was like this programmer laying down like horn parts and stuff. Not horn parts, laying down drum tracks. And Phil said to the guy, well, there's this one part that's just the 2/4 bar. And the guy looked at him like he was like talking from like outer space and said, this is a drum loop. And Phil was trying to let me try to explain how it works. I mean, the guy couldn't comprehend what a 2/4 bar meant. And he's laying down the drum tracks for a song. And it might have been the same session or a different one where somebody was putting in a sample and Phil said, that's in a different key. The guy had no idea what he was talking about.
Well, see, that's the interesting thing about music of today. If there's anything positive you could say is that most of it's modal because they don't do anything more than one key.
Or one chord.
The beats are what changes.
I heard this great interview with George Harrison, and he was talking about his take on the synth stuff. And he said, with the Beatles, he said, we would spend weeks getting like a certain sound for a certain part in a certain song. And he said, there was this whole creative process that went into it. And he said, now, it's like people push like, 285. And it said, so you've got all these songs where they basically have the same everything in there. And he said, like the whole creative process is gone. He said, we'd spend weeks getting a particular effect. And he said, now it's just, they use this, everybody's using the same programs and
same samples. We know that in the bass world, David. I had one, I can't think of who put it out. I'm going back almost 25 years ago when I had my studio, and you could push a button that said Chris Squire. Instead of developing my own sound, I'll just plunk out Chris Squire. Now, Arno, obviously being a horn player, Uptown Horns, you're always a sideman to the big stars. Talk about the temperament it takes to be a sideman, to be an adjunct to a band.
Yeah, we've done our own stuff too. The key thing is you have to get into whatever the music is and the artist is that you're playing for and fit yourself in appropriately. I mean, again, if you're playing on a balls out rock tune, you can't be playing Coltrane lick. You have to go along with what's appropriate for that song, for that artist.
How much do you research when now obviously the Stones, I mean, we all grew up listening to the Rolling Stones, but do you traditionally do a lot of research and listen to the artist before you do a session or a gig?
As a rule, not. Usually, a bunch of times you realize when we played with James Brown, we had a fairly good idea of what his shit was about. You go in and you can basically suss out pretty quickly what the artist is going for. And if not, they'll tell you. One of the big things is a lot of time with the horns, a lot of times we do our own arrangements. We do head arrangements and stuff like that. Again, it's somebody else's work. You're fitting yourself into that. So one of the key things that calls for something relatively basic, you don't do some sort of fancy florid 16-note thing, that isn't what they're looking for. And again, you have to be willing, you do something and they say, well, could you do more of this? Sure.
Yeah. Okay.
You're paying the bills,
Well, Arno, a good case is when you have something as we've all read Life, so we all understand there's a lot of stuff that went on between Mick and Keith that, well, essentially tell the story, because if I recall from what you were telling me, you were much more Keith's choice than Mick's. So there was, certain amelioration that you had. You like that word, Tom? Certain
You've been using your thorosis again, David.
Well, there you go.
As opposed to herosis, which would be a whole other holiday.
With the matzah, of course.
Yes.
We're hiding the Afrikomen, but I don't know where.
That's right.
But seriously, right from the get, you had other issues besides the music that you had to, not so much tiptoe, but you had to be conscious of, correct?
You have to be. I mean, actually, with the Stones, Mick was the one who kind of decided he wanted to hire us. But then just in terms of personal relationships, we ended up getting a lot tighter with Keith just over time, partly because, Keith is just this very down-to-earth guy. And so we ended up spending a lot of nights hanging out with Keith. And you have to walk the line. You have to suss out the sensibilities and internal relations and politics with people in the band. You have to be sensitive to that.
So tell us, so Keith, more the down-to-earth guy, so he was a natural hang, and it's just the way it is.
He was
Plus,
a natural
singers have
hang,
to take
and he was very nice to us and was into hanging. Keith is the kind of guy who, meet the richest guy in the world and decide he doesn't like him, piss all over him, and then he could decide that he liked some guy he met pumping gas and he'd want to hang with the guy, which is sort of his nature. So that was the deal. So, night after night, those guys were always, as a rule, prisoners in their hotel rooms.
Right.
They couldn't even to the hotel bar or whatever. You kind of get the word like, hey, Keith would like you guys to come by and hang out tonight. Of course, we would.
I remember one night I went to Shakespeare's Books. Remember that on 81st? And
sure.
Broadway? Mick lived around the corner. He wanted to buy a book. He was literally skulking around so that no one would recognize him, when if he would have not skulked, less people would have been looking at this short person skulking. It must be tough. I think each and every one of us would love that opportunity to have that. Yet at the same time, it's almost great that we don't.
There's always a quid pro quo, it seems. And certainly those guys paid a price for the fame. They've dealt with it, obviously. When we played Prague, Soviet Union had only collapsed several months earlier.
Right.
Czechoslovakia at the time, Václav Havel was the president. He had all these people in his government, like high officials who were like artists and musicians and like guys with long hair and beards. And it was the largest audience. It was all stadiums for that tour. It was the Steel Wheels tour. Played this stadium. It was 110,000 people. Most of them had never been to a rock concert, let alone something on that scale. What was great, I mean, talk about, there was this spirit in the air that was just magic. And what was great was where there had been a huge portrait of Stalin was replaced with the Stones Yaya logo. And the posters for the concert said, tanks are rolling out, Stones are rolling in.
That was the Rolling Stones. Keith Richards singing Happy with the Uptown Horns in Prague, 1990. This is Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com.
The very first one we did with them in Philadelphia was the first concert of the year. Sort of interesting. They played Shattered was the third song.
What year was this? What year?
This
89.
was 89, 90.
Yeah, I remember that.
And so Shattered was the third tune in this set. As they were playing Shattered, the generator overheated and the whole stage went down 40 minutes. And it was a whole thing where they had to run around getting tons of dry ice to throw on top of the generator to cool it down and stuff. They never played Shattered again the entire tour.
Well, you know why? It's obvious because when they did Sympathy for the Devil at Altamont,
there you go. I mean, same.
They learned.
That also has to be an incredible transition because you're used to playing clubs where you can see people and you can feel the energy. How do you feel the energy, or is it a different type of energy, I would imagine, when you're in a stadium with 110,000 people and you have this massive PA system around?
We had already had our share of having played 20,000 seaters, with the Geils Band.
That was the Geils Band live doing the Cannibal and the Headhunters tune, Land of a Thousand Dances, with an incredible tenor sax solo by our guest, Arno Arno Hecht. This is Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com.
We did a tour with Robert Plant as the Honey Drippers.
That was Robert Plant, the Honey Drippers, rockin' at midnight. This is Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com.
Those were also, that was like 20,000 seaters and stuff like that. So, once you get to a certain point, the difference between 20,000 or 60,000 or 110,000, it's all kind of a haze anyhow, especially, and my stage thing is I wear shades. Right. I can't really see more than 10 rows in front of me anyhow.
Obviously, with the record industry is no more, really, not as we knew it anyway. Really now, artists have all the tools at their disposal in a sense with distribution, artistic control. You no longer have to go before a record company and say, please put this out. However, there is the compensation. Is it the best of times or the worst of times? What are your thoughts on the digital distribution? Is it better for the artist?
I think it's great that people don't have to be tied to a major label to get their stuff out. What's a drag is that, you hear these stories where someone have $1.5 million hits. What they collect in money is $1,600 or something.
Yeah, if that much, yeah.
If that much. So kind of a mixed bag. I mean, I think it's great. Any number of artists who become popular just by virtue of being on Spotify, being on YouTube, being on all kinds of stuff. But as I said, a lot of people don't see any.
In the days of the record industry, a lot of artists didn't make money from their records, right? David, we were just talking to George Porter, and he said, man, it took me over 30 years to get any royalties from Meters records. And it seems that it's almost going back to the day when records were really just a promotional tool, and you made your money and you made your bones on the road playing gigs.
Right. That's a fact, too. I mean, songwriter mechanicals and publishing made for artist royalties. You first have to recoup every meal the record company ever paid for before songwriting and mechanicals and stuff kick in from the first album sold.
Right.
But that's a mixed thing too. In fact, that sort of led to the breakup of a number of bands because you'd have bands where one or two guys wrote all the material. So, like Lennon and McCartney made a shitload more money than George Harrison ever made.
Right. That's
who in turn made a lot more money than Ringo ever made. And so you'd have this sort of very unequal situation where you'd have a band that was struggling for years and they finally hit, and one or two guys end up becoming millionaires and the other guys are maybe making 60 grand a year. And they feel that's not entirely fair. A couple of bands dealt with it, but just, like the Doors, they credited all four guys on every Zeppelin. They basically did that with most of their material.
Amid all this gloom and doom, what does Arno have to achieve? What do you still have to do in life?
Keep living. That's always a good start. I still get to play and record with a bunch of different people.
All right, Arno, you're in good company. David and I have had quite a roster of interview subjects. Gosh, we just, we're best buddies now with Ron Carter.
I mean, talk about high level company.
Yeah, we did. Richard Thompson was very good with us. Of course, all our bass heroes, guys like Rick Wills and Carmen Rojas. You ever do a session with Carmen Rojas?
Played with Carmen. I can't remember where or how. A lot of times.
That was maybe with Rod Stewart when he was with Ron. Maybe you ever do anything with Rod Stewart?
I didn't do anything with Rod Stewart. But meanwhile, a lot of times when I go in or when the horns go in to do something, it's like after the basic tracks.
Right, after the fact, yeah.
I mean, when I first started doing it, again, when I was married, I'd come home and my wife would say, who was the rhythm section? I go, I don't know.
Yeah, such was life in the studios. And what else? We did John Altman. We mentioned Michael Manring, Larry Grenadier. Leo Lyons from 10 Years After was a lot of fun.
Wow.
And who do we got next week? For the young kids, we always put something.
Michael Lee. Yes.
Michael Lee.
Barrett Sullivan. And for you youngins.
For you youngins, Snarky Puppy in there. And so, we're building up quite a roster.
To resume.
Well, because everyone's home. No one's working,
Well, now hopefully that's all changing slowly but surely. I mean, the live gigs are starting to come back. So
Yeah, we hope so. All right. Okay. Well, great stuff, gentlemen.
Well,
Arno, good to see you. Me. All right. And
as always.
We'll put in the tracks and we'll do some video. And we'll send you links to everything. And you can, we'll send it to you on America Online.
I know. Great to see you.
Great to see you. Thanks for having me. A real pleasure. And Tom, thanks so much.
And there you have it. A great conversation with Arno Hecht, the tenor sax giant of the Uptown Horns. Next week, we have something real special. Sal Maida, who played bass with a bunch of folks from Roxy Music to Milk and Cookies, and A&R man, musical devotee Mitchell Cohn, they did a book together. And we're going to be talking with both of them about that book next week and the week thereafter. So thank you again for listening to Notes from an Artist. As of tomorrow, this particular broadcast will be up on our podcast page. You can get our podcasts anywhere from Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts. You name it, we're there. So tune in next Monday night, 8 p.m. Eastern, for Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com. This is David Gross. I want to thank Tom Semioli, my co-host, and of course Arno Hecht for a great interview. Again, you guys take care. We'll see you next Monday. Bye-bye now.